Hey class, welcome back. It's the first lecture of the second part of the semester. I hope you survived the midterm okay. This lecture is going to go up the night of the midterm, but don't worry, it's really for after the midterm. I don't really expect you to look at it until Friday, Saturday, whatever. It's just important for me to get the material begun so that we can get where we need to be by the end of the semester. My wife encouraged me to decide not to bother to shave before this lecture, so we're going to see how that goes. My cats are wandering around down here, so whatever. Second half of the semester, things are just going to go crazy. All right, so we're going to pick up the story. It's 1812. James Madison is the president, and he has been strongly encouraged, in fact, prodded and pushed by the war hawks, the folks, the younger politicians in Congress, who have been pushing the U.S. to go to war against the British. Okay, you'll remember that the three concerns that the war hawks, and more broadly a lot of Americans had, were that the British were interfering with American trade, the British were kidnapping American sailors, that's called impressment, and the British, they thought, were interfering with the Native Americans in the Great Lakes region. That last one made sense to some Americans, although it doesn't really make sense historically. But they saw the actions of Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, the prophet, and were convinced that that meant that the British up in Canada were manipulating them. So that one wasn't actually true, but they thought it was. So now, Madison, to his credit, really didn't want to go to war. He had seen how bad a war was, having lived through the American Revolution and how lucky they were. But a series of incidents that finally just pushed them over the edge. And in 1812, he asked Congress for a declaration of war, and they were ready to oblige. In fact, they had been bugging him about this for quite some time. So thus begins the War of 1812. And I have to say, the U.S. has had some not very smart wars in its history, and this is one of the not so smartest ones. It's even got a dumb name because it starts in 1812, but it doesn't finish in 1812. So it shouldn't be called the War of 1812. It should be called something else. Not sure what exactly that would be, but we should come up with something better than that. All right, well, since two out of the three issues that started the war were about things on the high seas, I'm sure you're thinking, well, this is going to be a naval battle and there'll be lots of ships involved, but not really, because the U.S. didn't really have much of a navy. Most of the naval battles that were fought, and there were some, were fought on the Great Lakes because that's about the small scale that the U.S. Navy can actually get involved in. Instead, the U.S. plan was to invade Canada because it's British territory and it's just to the north of the United States. And so the Americans thought that if they invaded Canada, where there were some Americans and they thought that it was lightly controlled, they thought they would have an easy chance of taking a lot of territory. They invaded Canada out of Michigan, basically, and headed over toward Ontario, and then got pushed back. And that didn't work out very well at all. And then suddenly, it's almost as if everybody realized, oh wait, oh yeah, these are the British. These guys are tough, because it got much tougher after the initial excitement of, hey, we're going to go to war again. The British were focused on fighting against the French. Fighting against Napoleon was their big deal in this period. And so for them, this was sort of an annoying sideshow. But they did do a sort of cost effective thing. By this time, the French Navy was basically kaput. So they had some extra ships that they didn't really need to worry about too much. And so what the British did was they set up a blockade around the around the American coast, up and down the Atlantic seaboard, which made it very, very difficult for the Americans to engage in any kind of trade. And given that trade was already pretty weak after all the problems with neutrality and the British and the French attacking their ships and so forth, now they really can't get any ships in or out. And this leads to a major economic depression, recession certainly, but definitely a major economic downturn, especially in the cities that rely on trade along the eastern seaboard. So that's Boston, Philadelphia, New York, places like that. And it had especially, as had been the case with the Embargo Act a few years earlier, which is sort of about the same thing, it had a very, very deleterious effect on the New England economy, which was so heavily engaged in trade. Now, it's worth pointing out that people in New England had been a little bit less interested in this war in the first place, because that's really the last place where there's any significant number of Federalists. The Federalists are not too excited about a war that seems to not really be helping them economically, and they're a little bit skeptical about James Madison as a Republican president. And as their economy went straight into the dumper, people in New England began to refer to this war as Mr. Madison's War, as if it wasn't their fault too. And honestly, people from all over the country had voted for this. I would say that the War of 1812 was broadly supported, but not deeply supported. And when it started to turn bad, then a lot of fingers got pointed, and it leads to a lot of internal dissension, the way a crisis sometimes does. Well, things are not looking good for the Americans, and then to make matters worse, in 1814, they had some small victories. The stuff on the Lake Erie, the Great Lakes, is a little victory in Lake Erie, but for the most part, had very little to hang their hat on. And then the worst possible thing that could have happened to the Americans happened, which is that Napoleon was finally defeated and exiled, which meant that the British are not fighting the French anymore after 1814. Instead, the only people that they're fighting left over is the Americans, and they can turn their entire attention to the United States, which already was struggling in the war of whatever you want to call it. And that really is bad news for the Americans. So, in 1814, the British launched a major invasion of the United States focused on our area, the Chesapeake area. They launched a major attack on Washington, D.C., the capital of the U.S. And although there was some resistance to the British attack on the capital city, the U.S. was really not able to muster up much defense of the city, and ultimately Congress had to flee. The president had to flee. The president's mansion basically just got evacuated the last second. President Madison went one way, his wife went the other way. She stuck it out a little bit longer because she wanted to save some of the fine china and silverware, and also a famous painting of George Washington that she was pretty sure that she knew what the British were going to do if they found that when they got to the president's mansion. They did leave behind a dinner that was supposed to be eaten, and so when the British soldiers burst into the former home of President and Mrs. James Madison and found some food at the table, they helped themselves to that, and then they basically set the thing on fire. And that's pretty much what they did to all of Washington, D.C. The tiny little place, almost nothing going on there anyway, as I mentioned in the last class. So there's not much to destroy, but they did their darndest and laid the wrecking torches and then headed off. So that's not good. Not a particularly fine moment for the United States when their capital gets sacked, essentially, destroyed, and the government is fleeing in all different directions. After that, the British turned their attention farther up the Chesapeake and launched an attack on Baltimore, which is economically the most important city in the Mid-Atlantic, and is also, because of its harbor, is an important port, and therefore seemed like a good place to launch an attack. But it was defended, as you probably know, because you've seen it on Baltimore license plates and you've heard the legends. And if you grew up around here, you probably had to go on some sort of field trip to the place. But anyway, Baltimore is defended by a fort that's on an island in the middle of the harbor called Fort McHenry. And before the British can get into and attack the city of Baltimore, they have to somehow get past that fort, which was defended to the gills by the Americans who were at that fort. And we know about this story from a bunch of things, but one eyewitness account comes from an American who was captured earlier and wound up on one of the British ships in Baltimore Harbor that was bombarding Fort McHenry all through a long night of bombardment as the bombs are just bursting in the air over the fort. And this man, this American patriot, is fretting all night long because he's convinced that when he wakes up in the morning, that he's going to see that the American soldiers at the fort will have lowered the flag, which would be their way of surrendering. But to his amazement, when the sun came up the next morning, he saw that the flag was still flying, which meant indeed that the Americans were still fighting on. And as it turned out, the British had pretty much decided that if they couldn't get past Fort McHenry, they were going to sort of try something else. And so the success of the Fort McHenry defenders basically saved Baltimore and possibly saved the entire U.S. from something much worse because the British kind of backed up and reoriented their strategy. This guy is a guy named Francis Scott Key, and he was so excited about what he had seen that at the dawn's early glare, that flag, that big flag over Fort McHenry was still there, that he decided that he would take a famous British drinking song and write new lyrics to it to sort of commemorate the event, specifically how proud he was of that flag. That, of course, became the Star-Spangled Banner, which eventually became our national anthem. So it's not the greatest war that the Americans are ever involved in, but it does give us our national anthem. Although I have to say, me personally, I can think of a few other songs in the history of the United States that I would rather were the national anthem. Star Spangled Banner is a little bit hard to sing. It's based on sort of a strange war. And if you get past the first verse and dig a little deeper, some of the other verses are quite problematic. But anyway, that is going to be one of the legacies of this war, the Star Spangled Banner. Huzzah. Now, as it turns out, part of the reason why the British didn't continue to fight their way into the Chesapeake when they're clearly winning is that strategically they had sort of thrown their efforts at DC and at, generally speaking, what they thought was sort of the soft underbelly of the Chesapeake, but they weren't really expecting that they were going to take back all the United States. It's just too big at this point. And they had just beaten Napoleon, which was really their goal. So the British really decided that although they were going to sort of try a few things and see how it went, they were willing to just sort of go back to the way things were. After all of the stuff they had gone through fighting against Napoleon, the British were pretty much thinking maybe it would be good for us to not do so much fighting anymore. Maybe that'd be a little bit less expensive for us to do, and maybe we should try things like diplomacy and economic development and all that kind of stuff. So the British are really not focused on trying to defeat the Americans, and in fact, even as this is happening, there are diplomats for both countries who are meeting in a little town in Belgium called Ghent. And eventually, the negotiators agreed that the two countries would just call it a draw, even though the British are really winning. It was pretty nice of the British. They didn't try to extract anything from the losing side. And so the Americans, those diplomats, they did a pretty good job in making the British be willing to just sort of call it even. But given that so many of the things that had started the war for the Americans are no longer an issue, they don't have to worry about the British or the French attacking them in the high seas because there's no war going on there, and they don't have to worry about being neutrality. That's not an issue. They don't have to worry about the British kidnapping their sailors because the British don't need sailors anymore. They don't have anybody they're fighting. And the Native American issue, although in theory still an issue because there are Native American tribes that the Americans are concerned about and want to take their land, they don't have to worry about Tecumseh anymore because Tecumseh, who did ally with the British and did fight on their side at the beginning of this war, was killed in a battle in 1813. And not long afterwards, it became pretty clear that the Americans were going to be able to take over the land that he and his allied tribes had been trying to defend. So most of those issues from the American side, they have gone away, and the British had no issues in the first place. They were just annoyed at the Americans. So the diplomatic sides agreed, and on Christmas of 1814, they agreed to this peace treaty, which in theory should end the war. The thing is, though, that treaty was signed in a tiny little town in Belgium all the way across the Atlantic, very far away from the United States, especially in those days when they don't have CNN, they don't have cell phones, they don't have any kind of modern telecommunication, and thus it takes a long time for the information to get from Ghent all the way here to the United States, where soldiers for both sides are still lined up against each other. And so that means that there's sort of a weird sequence of events in the waning days of the war. First, on the political front, as I said, up in New England, a lot of people had been very unhappy with this war. They'd been unhappy with it because they felt it was really killing them economically, and the last in a long series of problems that they've been having economically, as they felt that their trade was being stifled by all of the things going on, all of which they laid at the blame of the administration in Washington. And also, the people in New England are the last place where there are significant numbers of Federalists, and the Federalists by this time had clearly become a very small minority, and they really felt that that was not very fair because, as far as they were concerned, New England had started this country. After all, without the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre and the Sons of Liberty and things like that, there really never would be a United States of America. So the folks up in New England are feeling pretty angry, and they're worried that this war is just never going to end, and it's just going to keep doing worse and worse damage to their economy. And so, also in December of 1814, and they have no idea that there's a peace treaty about to be signed that's going to end the war and presumably solve their problems. Also in 1814, a bunch of New England Federalists got together in Hartford, Connecticut, which is the capital of Connecticut. Representatives from all the New England states, so places like Connecticut and Rhode Island and Massachusetts, so forth, got together in Hartford to try to hash out their concerns. There are some people who were there who were thinking that maybe New England should just start its own country, that New England should just pull out, just withdraw from the United States and go its own way. They're that worried, they're that concerned, they're that ticked off. But that didn't go anywhere. And that's all to the good because that would have been probably a crazy idea and just a bad idea in a lot of ways. But they didn't do that. Instead, though, they're angry enough that they hashed out a series of demands, which they then issued, which were published in newspapers and were sent down to Washington. They're calling for a series of changes to the Constitution, which they felt would benefit their region of the country, and they felt was only their just desserts because, as I just said, they felt like this was their country. The New Englanders were convinced that the United States was because of their region, and that therefore their region should not keep getting the short end of the stick. So they're calling for, in the Hartford Convention, as it's called, they're calling for a series of changes to the Constitution. And I'm just going to mention a few. There are a lot of them. None of them went anywhere. And they're really never going to go anywhere. They're all kind of sad and a little bit ridiculous. But just to give you some idea. So, one of the things they called for is an end to the 3/5 clause, which you'll remember during the ratification of the Constitution. Now, they're not liberals and saying we should count all the slaves equally as other people. No, what they're trying to do is say, let's not count the slaves at all. So, since the 3/5 clause gave the South extra representation in Congress, because they're at least counting the slaves a bit, what the New Englanders want is let's not count the slaves at all when we're dividing up the House of Representatives, and that therefore would tip the balance a little bit more toward them since they didn't have any slaves, and it would tip the balance away from the South where there really aren't any Federalists. Okay, so that's one thing they're calling for. They're also calling for a change in how wars happen and how new states are added. It's up to Congress to declare war, and it's up to Congress to admit new states into the country. Every time a new state is added, then it's a full partner in the United States, and they get congressmen and senators and so forth and so on. But for New England's point of view, it'd be better for them if there were no more states added, because the more states that are added, the less important New England was as a result. So what they're calling for is that rather than just a basic majority of both houses of Congress to bring in a new state, they want it to be a 2/3 majority, which would basically mean New England would have a pretty decent chance of blocking any new states. And likewise, for any future wars, they want there to be a 2/3 vote for a declaration of war, not just a basic majority, which again they thought would have allowed people from New England to stop Mr. Madison's war and thus not hurt their economy as much. Neither of these things are going to go anywhere. And then the most sort of astonishingly embarrassing example of how desperate they are, they focus on the president in one of their demands, and they call for a change of the Constitution demanding that the president serve only one single term. You can never serve more than one term, and no two consecutive presidents can ever come from the same state, which is sort of a weird, very specific thing. But if you look at where they're coming from, you can maybe understand it because at this point, so far, there have been the following presidents. There's been George Washington. He's from Virginia. So he's not from the Federalist region. He's not from New England. And he served 2 terms. Then they had a guy from New England, John Adams. He's from Massachusetts. He only served 1 term, though. And then he got voted out of office. He was followed up by Thomas Jefferson, who is also from Virginia and therefore not from New England, and he served 2 terms. So he got, 4 years there, 8 years there. And so then I have 4 total terms of people from Virginia, and they've only got 1 from New England. The guy who's in office when they're making these demands is, it's James Madison, and he's from Virginia. And so basically what they've had so far, and he just got reelected in 1816. So, in 1812. They've had nothing but Virginians and only 1 term of a guy from New England. So, and as it happens, I happen to know that the 1816 election, which is going to be the year after they make after the year after they make their complaints, James Monroe is going to become president, and he's from Virginia too. So of the first five presidents, four of them are from Virginia. One, two, three, four. Yeah, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and all those guys get two terms. And poor John Adams, the only one for New England, only got one term. So you can see where they're coming from, but this is also kind of sad. Maybe if we can not have the same guy get reelected, maybe we can throw in a guy from Connecticut every now and then, or something like that, is what they're asking for. And it shows a sign of desperation. Anyway, the Hartford Convention, they're never going to get what they want. It was really just an expression of their anger and an indication of just how much New England, and especially the Federalists in New England, were so upset by what they felt was the terrible damage being done by the War of 1812 to their economy. So put that aside for a second, and I jump ahead to the next month, January of 1815. Now the war should be over. The Treaty of Ghent had been signed, which was supposed to just sort of end the war, but the soldiers here in the United States don't know that it's happened, including the British soldiers. And although they think maybe the war is going to be over soon, they were thinking strategically, maybe if we can grab one goodie, maybe something we can hold on to. And an obvious thing that they could try to go for is the port of New Orleans. New Orleans, of course, is having tragically terrible times during the pandemic and has had a tough time ever since Katrina in 2005. It's a beautiful, wonderful city with amazing music and amazing people, but it is also strategically important and therefore vulnerable. It's right there at the bottom of the Mississippi River, which means all the trade coming down the river goes through the port of New Orleans, and so it's incredibly valuable, especially in the 19th century. And thus, the British thought, if we can attack New Orleans and succeed in taking the city, then maybe that's something we can hold on to. So in January of 1815, the British launched a big attack on the city of New Orleans, which was fairly lightly defended. There are some American soldiers there, but mostly the people who are defending the city are just local citizens and a local militia. And then there's some army people there led by a guy named Andrew Jackson, who is an army officer. If you had money to spend and you wanted to bet on what's going to happen in New Orleans, it looked pretty bad for the Americans because they're outnumbered, they're outgunned, and the British, they know what they're doing. But to the amazement of everybody, when the dust settles, Andrew Jackson didn't just succeed in defending the city and repulsed the British attempt to take New Orleans, he crushed them. The British lost like 2,000 soldiers, and Jackson lost a couple dozen. Is a major, major victory. And the way it turns out is that right after the Battle of New Orleans, and thus right after the Americans' big victory, pretty much their only victory of any real significance in the war, after that's over, then everyone finds out about the Treaty of Ghent. And so the real sequence is Treaty of Ghent, then Battle of New Orleans. But the way everybody hears about it is Battle of New Orleans, big American victory, Treaty of Ghent, which means that the British must have given up. And now let's factor in the Hartford Convention, because what really happened was Hartford Convention, Treaty of Ghent, Battle of New Orleans. But the way people hear the story is Hartford Convention, Federalists from New England complain a lot. Battle of New Orleans, big major victory, hooray. Treaty of Ghent, Americans win the war. And that sequence, as people perceive it, leads immediately to people turning at everyone in the country, looking at the people who'd been at the Hartford Convention and saying, what was your problem? Why were you guys so upset? What is wrong with you? You're so unpatriotic. Because after the war is over, in the very last seconds of the war, that's about the only time that everybody gets really excited about this war, just as it ends, because of the smashing success of the war of the Battle of New Orleans. Andrew Jackson becomes a major American hero, but also a lot of people after the war is over are convinced that the U.S. won a war that it was losing most of the time, and at best was probably a draw. But at the end, there's this big victory, and in the burst of patriotism that followed, everyone associated with the Hartford Convention looked so bad that ultimately the Federalists, who had been the leading lights of the Hartford Convention, the Federalists just basically went out of business. You can't be a Federalist anymore after that because they're associated with anti-patriotism. They're associated with people who are against the war. The War of 1812 seems afterwards to be a big success. The Hartford Convention seems afterwards to have been just a bunch of bellyachers, and anyone associated with it just has to get out of politics, which means that the Federalists have to get out of politics, and they were dying anyway. They're pretty much just a New England group. But even in New England, you can't be a Federalist anymore. You can't even be elected dog catcher if you're associated with being a Federalist. And essentially what happens after the War of 1812 is that as the Federalists disappear, there's only one political group left. Jefferson's group, the Democratic Republicans, which I think I'm safe in just calling Republicans at this point, they're the only thing left. They're the only show in town. And the result is, with the Federalists gone, that there's only one political group, only that one faction is the only one that's left. And there's this very strange moment in American history when it appears that there's just going to be no political opposition anymore. It appears it's just going to be the Republicans. This period where there's just one political group and apparently no more political opposition, and maybe all politics has disappeared now, this period is referred to as the era of good feelings, which I've always thought sounds ridiculous. It sort of sounds like those hippie days, when everybody's sitting around and they're smoking their banana peels and they're listening to their Donovan records and stuff, hey man, peace and love kind of stuff. That's what it sounds like, but it's actually what they called it. Not long after the Federalists went out of business, President Monroe, the president who took office after James Madison, a Republican from Virginia, went up to New England, where previously Republicans from Virginia would not have been very popular, and he is cheered as he goes through the streets by these huge crowds. And a newspaper editor says, clearly we have entered an era of good feelings when a Republican from deepest Virginia will be greeted in the streets with screaming crowds in Massachusetts. So, something's going on. And the something is that the Federalists have gone out of business. I can tell you that probably this is not the way politics is really ever going to work, and probably something like this can't last forever. And that's a hint. But for about a decade, this was the situation. There's just the Republicans. The Republicans are the only show in town. The Federalists, the party that believed in big government and supporting banks, the party of Alexander Hamilton and John Adams, they're gone. They don't exist anymore. Okay? And then weird stuff starts to happen. Because with the Federalists gone, Republicans can do pretty much whatever they want, and they started passing laws and implementing policies that sounded like their defeated opposition. So the Federalists had been the party that believed in big banks, and the Republicans had opposed big banks. After the War of 1812 was over, well, some of the leaders of the Republicans said, we need to make the economy stronger. We need to make sure that we regulate the smaller banks. We need so it can have some sort of currency, a banknote that people can trust. We need a Bank of the United States, which is exactly what they had opposed in a previous generation. Now that no one's there to stop them, in 1816, the Republicans suggested the creation of a second Bank of the United States, run exactly like the old one, a private company, branches in different parts of the country. They had let the old one die, but now they bring it back with a new name, basically the same name, and they did keep it with a 20-year lease. So the first one was 1791. They let it die in 1811. Now the new one starts in 1816, and it's going to get a 20-year deal to stay through 1836. And that's a crazy thing for Republicans to do, but they did it. The Republicans also, during the era of good feelings, decided that they liked tariffs, which is also pretty strange because Republicans in the 1790s thought that high tariffs were terrible. But they decided that it was time to have high tariffs to protect American industry, which is exactly what Alexander Hamilton had said, and the Republicans had attacked him and been utterly opposed to his ideas. Now here they are during the era of good feelings, and they support a high tariff, which, I mean, I don't know what, maybe there is something in the water during the era of good feelings. The key in the era of good feelings is a guy in Congress, the Speaker of the House and one of the most important congressional leaders of the first half of the 1800s is a guy named Henry Clay from Kentucky. And I mentioned Clay previously. He's one of the war hawks, but this is his big moment. Clay will never be president, which is why it turns out that many people have forgotten about him, other than historians like yourselves. Um, but he is an incredibly influential and very important figure from his seat of power in Congress. Clay called for, in the years after the War of 1812, what he described as the American system. His concern was that the United States had gotten quite large. It's not just the original 13 colonies anymore. If you include all the land that they've gotten, including the Louisiana Purchase, this is a nation of the first order. It is one of the largest by land mass, one of the largest countries in the world at that time. And yet it was clearly not in any way economically united. It really is just sort of a hodgepodge of sort of local economic and political entities, and therefore couldn't really stand up for itself. And the War of 1812 had really shown that in a lot of ways. The U.S. was pretty weak despite the size of the nation. So, what Henry Clay was calling for was for the federal government to get in the business of helping unify and link up the different parts of the country to make it a fully unified and integrated economic unit. So, what he's calling for is, yes, a bank. He's one of the main idea guys behind the creation of the Second Bank of the United States, because he knows that if they're going to have big projects, they need to have big banks that can make those kinds of loans and help sort of stimulate the economy and unify the economy. He's calling for tariffs because he's convinced that high tariffs will help protect American business and protect them against the British, who are better at that sort of stuff so far, and therefore make the U.S. better able to sort of defend itself economically against cheap imports coming from the outside. And then what he's really calling for, and really the most important part of the American system, is for economic development in the form of what was called at the time internal improvements. Today, we would call it that. Today, we would call this infrastructure. Which, so basically what he's calling for is for the building of things that will link the country together, literally link it together. So he's calling for roads and canals. He's calling for anything that will help tie the country and the different parts of the country together so that people can do business with each other more easily. Today we would have things like that, but also, bridges or airports or better Wi-Fi connections or something like that. All those would be part of modern infrastructure. They haven't gotten to a lot of that stuff yet, so it's pretty simple: bridges, roads, I guess, some canals as well. So those are the infrastructure, the internal improvements that are called for in the American system. And the key thing here is that he thought the government should get involved, actively involved, in making this happen. It's great if private companies want to do it, it's great if states want to do it, but he felt there needed to be an active federal role involved in linking up the country and making it stronger and more unified, and therefore he thought better moving forward. And again, this sounds very much not like what the Republicans had stood for in the earlier generation when Jefferson was their leader. Republicans at that point had stood for small government, a government that stayed out of the economy. But under Henry Clay's leadership, the American system idea of the era of good feelings is that Republicans think the government should have an active role in the economy. And so things had gone very, very different. And it's a very strange time politically. It's also not a perfect time. Although the era of good feelings sounds like everybody sits around and they just sort of think that everyone else is cool, man. There were some other issues. One is a major economic issue. In 1819, so during President Monroe's term, the economy took a major dip because a lot of the banks had problems. This is called the Panic of 1819. The American banking system is very, very screwed up in those days. And they make a lot of loans to each other, and then if a bunch of banks, important banks, collapse because of bad decisions, that has a ripple effect throughout the banking system, and that has a ripple effect throughout the overall economy. That happened in 1819, and it led to, I'm not going to call it a depression because the U.S. economy is mostly farmers and they can handle this, um, but it is a major recession. And a lot of the more economic, trade, and manufacturing parts of the country had a major downturn as a result of that until the banking system got fixed up again. People lost money. The people who went bankrupt as a result of this big banking collapse. It turns out that this is the beginning of a wave of economic troughs as there's a cycle that happens over the ensuing century or so. As the US expands economically, and overall it does expand a lot economically, there are times when that cycle goes up, 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 and then crashes. 1819 is the first example of that, and although it's bad to live through, it's not as bad as some of the other ones that are coming. But there's almost like a 20-year pattern through most of the rest of the 19th century and a little bit beyond that. So this one happens in 1819, and it takes a few years for the American economy to come back from that. Then in 1837, which we'll get to soon, there's a major economic crisis, and that one is really a depression. There's a small one in 1857, which I'll never mention again, but it did happen. After the Civil War, just so you know, the pattern continued. In 1873, there's a major crash. This one not driven by banks, but by other economic instability that led to basically depression. 20 years after that, to the dime. In 1893, there's a major, major economic depression, the Panic of 1893, which they called the Great Depression, but then later there's one that's worse. If you jump ahead to the early 20th century, there's a big banking downturn in 1907 that leads to a pretty big recession. Right after World War I, there's a major decline in 1919. Then through the 20s, big expansion, and then the huge crash, the one that people have been comparing our current, and please let it be much shorter and not as severe. But anyway, the numbers in our of unemployment and so forth, people are saying is a lot like the Great Depression, which started in 1929 and didn't really end until World War II. So after that, people started to say maybe the government should do something to stop this sort of thing from happening, and the rest of the 20th century mostly went a little bit better. But going back to 1819, they had no idea this is the beginning of a pattern. All they know is that they lived through it, and it wasn't very fun to have the banking system collapse and to have the ripple effects that that had throughout the economy. All right, that's the broad outline of what's going on in the era of good feelings and how it got its name and how it grew out of the War of 1812 and some of the weird politics. What I need to do, and these will both take a little while, is talk about two big events that took place during the era of good feelings. And then we will wrap up and in the next lecture find out how they started hating each other again the way Americans are supposed to. So, the first one is about slavery. So when I last mentioned the topic of slavery, I mentioned that the New England states and some of the Mid-Atlantic states had abolished slavery. In New England, right around and right after the American Revolution, and then in places like New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, somewhat more slowly, but they were getting rid of it. The southern states, however, did not, and it'll be more clear next week some of the economic reasons why they didn't, but they didn't. But what happened as the country expanded is that also some of the new states had slavery and some of the new states didn't. And some of that had to do with government policy, but a lot of that had to do just with who went where. Basically, settlement patterns wound up going almost directly straight west. So people from New England are more likely to wind up in places like Ohio and Indiana, and people from the Chesapeake and the farther south early colonies are more likely to wind up in places like Kentucky and Tennessee, and eventually a little bit farther into places like Mississippi and Alabama, etc. So what that means is that as new states got added, they had laws about slavery that represented the same kinds of policies as the place where the settlers had come from. And as it turns out, and this wasn't really planned, it just worked out that way. If you stop the story in 1819, 1820, it turns out that they have an exact even number of slave states in the South and non-slave states in the North. And roughly the dividing line was the Mason-Dixon line around here, which is the line on the map between Maryland and Pennsylvania. Or if you jump across the mountains, the line is basically the Ohio River, where south of that you get Kentucky, which has slavery, but north of that, Ohio does not. That's roughly the way the line had worked. And so nobody had planned that. It just sort of worked out that way. And what that means is that in the Senate, there's an even number of people who basically represent the slavery point of view, and an equal number of people who represent essentially the non-slave point of view. Although they haven't really thought about themselves as different sections yet, and they haven't really thought about themselves as defining themselves based on whether they have slavery or not. It's been an issue in small ways, but you jump ahead a generation and past the Constitution, it's not something that's really defined American politics yet. But then things started to focus a little bit differently because they're starting to try to figure out what to do about all that land that the U.S. got during the Louisiana Purchase. They had carved out the state of Louisiana right after that and turned that into the state of Louisiana, basically the stuff around New Orleans and a little bit outside that, the sugar parishes and so forth. And they knew that that was going to be slave territory because no matter whether it had been French or Spanish or French again, there had been slavery there because of all the sugar plantations dating back to the early days of settlement. And so that was pretty clear that that was what was going to happen. But by 1820, there are enough people living in the territory that's called Missouri, which is basically the area around St. Louis along the Mississippi River. So that part of the Louisiana Purchase was ready to become a state based on the rules of how many people have to live in a territory before they can petition to become a state. And so the way this works is a territory is managed by the federal government. There's sort of some local rules and some local control, but the federal government makes the laws and makes the policies overall. When there's enough people, and there's a specific number that's been changed at different times, when there's enough people living in that territory, then they can ask to become a state. And the way they do that is they get together, the people in that territory, and they write up a rough draft of a constitution for their state. Every state has a constitution the same way the federal government does, but obviously there's differences depending on which state it is. So they come up with a draft of a constitution, and then they send that to Congress. They say, we'd like to be a state, and we'd like this to be our constitution that will manage us, and then Congress votes and says yes or no. So the people in Missouri decided that they were ready to be a state, and they got together and they wrote up a draft of a constitution, and then they sent that off to Congress, and then the people in Congress have to decide what to do about it. The thing is, though, that Missouri broke the rule, that pattern that I was describing, because so far the dividing line out west had been basically the Ohio River. And therefore, it looked like where the Ohio River sort of goes into the Mississippi, it looked like, just based on the map, that Missouri would be a free state. But it had been settled by people from more southern states, and there are plenty of people in Missouri who owned slaves, and therefore, when Missouri asked to become a state, they asked to become a slave state. But Northerners got worried about this because they're looking at the map and they were worried that this is the first real big decision we have to make about the Louisiana Purchase. The state of Louisiana was an easy one, but Missouri is going to help set the tone for the rest of that whole huge amount of territory. And it looked to the north like what was happening here was the South was trying to get grabby, that the South was trying to get their fingers into a part of this territory that maybe another world would not have been something that they could have gotten to, Northerners are worried that if they let Missouri become a slave state, then any other state that came out of Louisiana Purchase might wind up being a slave state also. And they're looking at the map and they're worried that if the whole Louisiana Purchase gets turned into slave states, then eventually New England and the upper Midwest would be the minority of the country, and the slave states south and west would basically dominate them. And so they wanted to stop that now before it could become an issue. So, Northerners opposed admitting Missouri as a slave state. Southerners, for their part, looked at the map and said, oh, this would be cool because if we get Missouri, then we have turned the tide and begun to sort of spread in a direction that it didn't look like we were going to get into, and therefore they pushed very hard for Missouri to be allowed as a slave state. And basically, starting in 1819 and through much of 1820, this was the big issue. This is the big issue in Congress, and it turns into the big issue in the public discussion. Because Congress adjourned in 1819 before they can resolve the problem, and then they went home, and then locally they told their constituents what was going on, and newspapers in the North said, we can't let Missouri be a slave state, and newspapers in the South said, we better make Missouri a slave state. And when the Congress got back together again in 1820, then both sides are very riled up against each other. And this is the first real time that it looks like maybe people are thinking of themselves as Northerners and Southerners, and it's over the issue of slavery. And so this is a heated up issue, and it's a dangerous issue, and it's not really clear if there is a solution that's going to make both sides happy, except it's helpful that the big leader of Congress at this point is Henry Clay, who is a natural conciliator. He eventually would get known as the Great Compromiser. That's his nickname all the way to his dying day. It's to me not the greatest nickname in the world because it implies to be a compromiser sometimes implies that you don't really have any convictions of your own, but he does help the United States get over some major crises, and this is his first real test. Again, he's not president, he's the leader of Congress, but Congress is really where this is going to be solved. So, Clay in 1820 offered a proposal that he was able to get through Congress. There are Northerners who get some things out of it, and there are Southerners who get things out of it, and they both have to give up things, so it is really a compromise. It's going to be known as the Missouri Compromise because Missouri is the issue. So, part of the idea of the Missouri Compromise, proposed by Henry Clay and passed by Congress, is that, well, if Missouri wants to be a slave state, then they can be a slave state. So, therefore, the balance between slave and free states is now out of whack. So, obviously, that's not going to make the North very happy. And so, Clay, in the same piece of legislation, proposed adding a new free state to help keep that balance. And specifically, what they proposed is to make Maine its own state. Maine had actually been part of Massachusetts, which is really weird because it doesn't touch Massachusetts, but the old colonial maps are very strange, and that was where Maine was originally on the map. So it had been a part, like a piece of Massachusetts that they had run for a while. But there's enough people living up there that they could become a state by now. And so Henry Clay proposes, let's just jumpstart that process and bring them in right now as a state. And obviously they're going to be a free state because they're in New England. There is no slavery up there. And therefore, it's going to help keep that balance. So Missouri comes in as a free state. Missouri comes in as a slave state. Maine comes in as a free state, and that will balance things out. But Clay's also worried about, are we going to have to keep arguing about this? Because there are going to be other states that are going to be created out of the Louisiana Purchase. And he didn't want there to be a recurring cycle of arguments between the North and the South over whether they can bring slavery into each of those territories and new states. So the last part of the Missouri Compromise resolves that problem. The bottom of Missouri, the southern border of Missouri, is on the map on the 3630 line, 36 degrees, 30 minutes north on the map, that straight line there on the map. And so what Henry Clay's Missouri Compromise does is take that line and draw it all the way west to the western border of Louisiana. Not all the way to the Pacific, because they don't own all the way to the Pacific, but all the way to the western border of the Louisiana Purchase. And then that line is going to divide the rest of the Louisiana Purchase between free territory to the north and slave territory to the south. So the 3630 line will divide the rest of the Louisiana Purchase. And that allows the South to know that they're going to get some territory in the future, the North to know they're going to get some territory in the future. They both have gotten something now. They both have given up something in the future. And therefore, this is a true compromise. And a measure of Henry Clay's greatness as a legislator is that he is able to get this passed. 1820, the Missouri Compromise. People who lived through this controversy, people who saw how angry and heated up this controversy led people to be, their response was, thank goodness, because it seemed pretty ugly. It seemed like this was the sort of thing that maybe could divide the country in a way that who knows what happened afterwards. It's 1820, it's not the Civil War. But people are starting to get a little worried about it, and the fact that Clay was able to come up with something that Congress could accept and that people both in the North and the South thought was reasonable as a compromise, they hoped that was the end of the discussion. And people who lived through this controversy afterwards put Clay on a pedestal and say, well, he saved the country. And they start to think about the Missouri Compromise as if it was almost as important to the success of the country as the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. It's almost that level of importance because they're convinced that it has ended their slavery discussion forever. Not so much ended it forever, and in fact, they will be arguing about slavery not immediately after the Missouri Compromise, but there will be big discussions of slavery coming again soon, and that's a preview of a lot of what we're going to hear as we move forward in the second part of the semester. But at the time, it seemed like quite a big deal to have solved this problem. In reality, the Missouri controversy of 1819 through 1820 is really the beginning of this problem of sectionalism, which is the division of the country into two sections, and a sectionalism that is defined by slavery. That is really a beginning. They put it off for a little while, but it's not gone forever. One last thing about the Missouri Compromise before we move on. To me, it's pretty obvious who got the better part of the deal, right? You look at the map, you look at the map of the whole Louisiana Purchase, you look where that 3630 line is, and it should be very clear, just looking at it, that obviously the side that got the better part of the deal was the South, right? Huh? Well, that's what everybody said at the time. And the reason why they said that was that the South had already gotten Louisiana State, which is New Orleans, major port, that's the big thing there. And now they had gotten St. Louis, which is the other really important port along the Mississippi River. And they had sort of worked their way up into territory that otherwise, based on the pattern, they probably shouldn't have gotten. The South got the two goodies, in other words, along the Mississippi River, and it wasn't really clear that there would ever be any states carved out of the rest of the Louisiana Purchase, or maybe not for hundreds of years, because early explorers had gone into places like Nebraska and the Dakotas and other places in what's now important Midwestern states, and they'd come back with reports that indicated that the soil and the climate and the things that grow there were not like anything east of the Mississippi River. And a lot of people heard about that and were convinced that no white people would ever live there, that no farmers could ever do their farming there. And it's, of course, incredibly ironic because that is the breadbasket of the country and indeed of the world. But at the time, the initial reports were that this was the great American desert and that no white man could ever live there. Native Americans might be breathing a sigh of relief because, maybe this means the white people aren't going to come take our land. Well, the white people are coming to take their land, it turns out, because eventually farmers did figure out, hey, this is a good place to grow things like grain and corn and other crops. But at first, at the moment, in 1820, when they're arguing about it, it seemed to a lot of people that the real goodies, the crown jewels, were New Orleans and St. Louis, and the South got those, and the rest of that land, great, there's going to be no slavery there. But if there's no people moving there, then it's not like the North's ever going to get any benefit from that. At the time, that's what they thought. You and I both know that in the long run, there will be a lot of states that will be carved out of the rest of the Louisiana Purchase, and therefore, in the long run, this really is good for the North. But in the moment, a lot of people in the North said, well, in the spirit of compromise, we let you guys get away with one there. We're trying to keep the balance and we're trying to keep the peace. But, except that we were pretty nice. But anyway, that just shows that things change over time. Okay, so we move away from this domestic issue, this internal politics that's related to that Missouri controversy, and instead now look overseas and specifically look internationally. And I'm gonna point your eyes now south of the United States into the Spanish territory, where the Spanish Empire we've been talking about almost since the beginning of the semester. Except the Spanish had begun to fall on real tough times. Partly military problems, partly internal domestic problems, partly just sort of mismanagement, partly they just ran their colonies very poorly and treated the people in the colonies very poorly, and partly just timing because the US had had a revolt against overseas control, which helped show some of the people in the Spanish colonies that it is indeed possible to be independent and to establish yourself as an independent country and a republic. So, in the early decades of the 1800s, that started to happen. Important leaders in what became new Spanish-speaking countries south of the United States helped throw off the chains of Spanish control. People like Simon Bolivar and others of his kin um, helped lead various people in the Spanish colonies against Spanish control, and that helped lead to the creation of independent countries. And so, in the early few decades of the 1800s, you get the establishment of countries like Bolivia and Venezuela and a bunch of other new Latin American republics that are created modeling themselves after the United States by Spanish speaking former colonists who are now citizens of their free new countries, new republics in Latin America. So this is, of course, this is a change that the Americans, the folks here in the U.S., their response is, "Hey, this is great. Republics are growing. There's going to be more of them. This is really, really good news." And the Spanish Empire is declining, and so the idea of imperialism and the ideas of all the mercantilist stuff and all that, that looks like that's fading away. And so this is going to be good news, and the U.S. will recognize these new countries and hopefully we can all get along and be good neighbors. In that way, it seems like good news. Except that the new countries that are established in Latin America seemed to not just the US, but to also a lot of the Europeans, like kind of weak countries. The new governments seemed a little bit unstable. The fact that they're all republics, the European monarchies thought that republics were a weak form of government, that they would never last. And as these new Latin American republics are in the early days of getting themselves going, there was a real fear that they would be sitting ducks, that they would be easy targets for somebody else to swoop in and take over. Maybe the Spanish should come back, although that doesn't seem that likely. But maybe the French would try to have an empire there. Napoleon's gone by this point, but somebody like a Napoleon might show up and try to get in there. Maybe the British, the British had an empire in North America and they still have Canada. Maybe they're going to try to head down there, or maybe somebody else, Russia. I mean, who knows? The real fear that the Americans have is that as they see the way European powers are looking at Latin America, they can tell that the people in Europe are saying, "Oh, that's a place we can get into." And that's terrifying for the Americans because the Americans like the idea of these new republics as their neighbors, but they really, really hate the idea of some kind of other imperial power taking over in what the Americans are starting to think of as their part of the world. So, there's some high level negotiations that went on between the US government and some of the European powers in the early 1820s during President Monroe's presidency as these new Latin American republics are being created and as Monroe and his top diplomats are trying to figure out sort of what's going on in Europe as they look at these new republics. Ultimately, those high level discussions eventually led the Americans to decide that they should issue a statement about this part of the world and about this concern that they had. And so a statement was issued by President Monroe in 1823, December of 1823. It'll be called the Monroe Doctrine. And a doctrine is sort of like a big idea, a big concept, a big thing you stand for. It's named after Monroe, and he is one of the chief architects of the policy, although a lot of the language is actually written by his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. And before I move any further, let's just point out how odd that is. You have President Monroe, a Virginia Republican, whose Secretary of State, and that's the most important cabinet job in those days, his Secretary of State is John Quincy Adams, the son of the only Federalist president. John Quincy Adams is serving a Republican administration because he's a Republican, because everybody's a Republican, but that's kind of weird. Politics is weird during the era of good feelings. Anyway, John Quincy Adams did a lot of the drafting of the ideas here, but it gets issued as part of President Monroe's State of the Union address. In those days, they don't make a speech, they just send something and they send it to Congress, and it gets published in the newspapers. In the section on foreign policy is this material, which becomes known as the Monroe Doctrine, because President Monroe is the guy who signs the document, and he did have a lot to do with it, besides just John Quincy Adams. So, in this statement about foreign policy, in the President's annual State of the Union address that becomes known as the Monroe Doctrine, President Monroe, speaking for the country, lays out a couple of key ideas about how the U.S. is going to look at the world. So, first of all, Monroe says the U.S. will make it a policy not to engage in any European wars, not to get involved in them, not to get dragged into them. Basically, he's reminding or reiterating the George Washington theory of be neutral, stay out of their problems, be isolationist, leave them to themselves. He's just reminding everybody of that. The next part of the Monroe Doctrine, he says that the U.S. will make it a policy not to interfere with any European colonies that currently exist in the Western Hemisphere. So there are, of course, other European colonies that still exist. Canada, which they just invaded a few years earlier, they're going to ignore that now. Canada is British, and they're not going to get in the way of that. Spain still has Cuba, and they still have some other colonies. France has some stuff in the Caribbean, and so forth. What Monroe is saying is that they can keep those. Those colonies, they're theirs. We're not going to interfere with that. That's their business. But the key thing of the Monroe Doctrine is those countries, European countries, should not try to set up any new colonies. Colonies you already have, you can hold on to. We're not going to bother you about that. But you should not try to set up any new colonies anywhere here in the Western Hemisphere. That, my friends, is crossing a line. And so, President Monroe makes pretty clear that if any European country tries to set up any new colonies anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, that the U.S. is going to take that as an unfriendly act. In other words, it's a threat. What Monroe is saying in the Monroe Doctrine is you can keep your colonies, but if you try to start any new ones, we, the U.S., will take that seriously. And the implication is that the U.S. may even fight about that, although that's not expressly written out. It's more just this is a policy that we believe that you guys shouldn't do. Okay. The Monroe Doctrine, as it turns out, is not something that the U.S. has to test because the Europeans really aren't in the colony-making business in Latin America in this period. Later in the 19th century, there's a lot of colony-making, a lot of imperialism in Africa and parts of Asia, and the U.S. doesn't care about that part of the world, so they don't interfere with that or have anything to say about that. But if the Europeans had, it's an interesting question to wonder, did Monroe really mean it? Did he really mean that the U.S. would go to war if, for example, Russia tried to take over Bolivia? I'm not sure that that is actually true, but we'll never know. because that's not where the Europeans were pointed in this time. Their response to the Monroe Doctrine was they thought it was kind of funny because the US is still a pretty weak country. It looks big on the map, but mostly it's big because it's got a lot of land and there's people there. But they don't really have an army or a navy. They mostly are just a bunch of farmers. And the idea that they're going to somehow stop some of the major world powers, which is to mean the major European powers, from doing anything they wanted is sort of ludicrous. So we'll never know for sure, but it doesn't seem like it really would have been a thing. But it's not really something that the Americans have to act on much, much later. 3 generations down the road, late 19th century and then the very beginning of the 20th century, as the U.S. relationship with the world starts to change, there will be future American leaders who will revive the Monroe Doctrine and say that this is proof that the U.S. is allowed to sort of push around some of some of their neighbors. And the Monroe Doctrine will be justified by Teddy Roosevelt and presidents after him for doing all kinds of weird stuff that will be resented by people all over Latin America. That's much later. At this point, the US is still a pretty weak little country, and this statement is kind of laughable because who is the US to tell France or Britain or Russia or whatever what to do? And in some ways, that's true. But it's worth pointing out that the Monroe Doctrine came from the US. There isn't a similar sort of a doctrine that comes out of any other country in the Western Hemisphere. Mexico did not issue a statement to the world saying, keep your hands off Latin America because if you do, we are going to take it personally. Neither did Peru or Bolivia or Venezuela. None of those countries stated to the world that you need to keep your hands off this part of the world or we're going to get mad. The US did, which shows that as early as 1823, when it is still in many ways a weak country, second rate probably at best in terms of its authority in the world, the US assumed that it was the most important country in the Western Hemisphere. The US assumed that it was going to be the most powerful country and the one that was going to be the decider. Later on, as I said, they're going to throw their weight around. But at this point, the implications are that the U.S. expects to be the most important country in this part of the world. No one really tested them, but that's what they're thinking. It's a patriotic kind of a document, but it's also kind of a hubristic sort of a document because the U.S. is saying, we're the tough guys. We're going to be the sheriffs. We're going to be the ones to kind of make the rules around here. It's an indication of something that's coming in the future as the U.S. will eventually start to throw its weight around a little bit more. For now, though, it's more a sign of things that are to come. Ends is really the last thing that I need to mention ever about foreign policy for the U.S. because for the rest of the century, the U.S. is going to expand in ways we'll talk about, stay out of European wars because of George Washington's ideas, and then not interfere with the rest of the Western Hemisphere because it turns out that there isn't any new colony making, but think that it sort of belongs to them in some ways. All right, that's the last major thing that we need to talk about for the era of good feelings. And it was a weird time when there's only one political party. You'll be glad to know that that lasted for only about a decade, and then things eventually changed surrounding a guy who you've seen in your $20 bill, Andrew Jackson. He's going to be the subject of our second lecture for Thursday the 16th. And again, I don't expect you to watch these lectures until probably Friday or later, but they're on the calendar for that day, and whose idea was that? Anyway, we'll pick that up next time. The Age of Jackson, well longer than this one. Possibly I'll shave in the meantime. Thanks for your time. I hope you did okay on the midterm. Here we are in the second half of the semester. I'm very excited. Thanks.